Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon, whether you're here in the Henage Auditorium with us or joining us virtually. I'm Carly Fiorina, and it's my great privilege to serve as the chair of the Board of Trustees here at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Our conversation today is about American citizenship. What does it really mean? It is one in a series of conversations about us, past, present, and future. We chose this topic several months ago, but never has the topic been more relevant. And so before we begin the conversation this afternoon with my friends and colleagues here on the stage with me, I'd like to just read briefly from a statement that Colonial Williamsburg issued earlier today, coincident with this program. Citizenship rests on the foundation of our most cherished civil rights and equal protection of those rights under the law. Despite generations of struggle and substantial progress as a nation, we have once again been vividly and tragically reminded that the rights and protections of citizenship do not apply to every American. All citizens should demand equal protection under the law for every American, as we are still not a nation of liberty and justice for all. At the same time as we witness these events, proposals are now advancing across the country that would likely make it harder for some to exercise their right to vote. Our nation's founders argued passionately and fought bravely for a representative form of government nearly 250 years ago. Yet the voting rights they envisioned then were limited to a privileged few, ensuring centuries of restricted rights, protections, and opportunities for so many others. Colonial Williamsburg is grateful for the courageous Americans who battled to originally establish the right to vote. And we are equally grateful for all those who have bravely fought ever since to expand, defend, and improve rights in this country. And we support those who continue to peacefully advocate for equal rights and protections under the law today. We urge all Americans to preserve and enhance the right of every eligible voter to make their voice heard. In doing so, we believe we honor the struggles and sacrifices of every American throughout our nation's history, who has been inspired by the ideal of citizenship and has striven to make our nation more just, equitable, and inclusive. So welcome to this very important conversation, and we'll get started right now.
Welcome to our first Cornerstone event for us, past, present, future. My name is Beth Kelly, and I have the honor of serving as Vice President for Education, Research, and Historical Interpretation at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Our panel this month will discuss the question, what does citizenship mean as an American? A few years back, I had the opportunity to address new citizens in this space, the Hall of the House of Burgesses, during a naturalization ceremony. It was for me the single most impactful experience that I have ever had as a citizen. That day, we all entered this chamber from different countries of birth, but at the end of the ceremony, we left unified as American citizens. I think about that day often, partly because of the work that I have been called to do here at Colonial Williamsburg. We care deeply about educating our audiences about civic responsibility. And in our work, we strive to impact our guests, students, and teachers to become better citizens. Our programming reveals the complexities and tensions inherent at the moment we were all attempting to become Americans. But when I think about that day, it is actually less about my work and more about my personal commitment as a citizen. As I sit and listen to the U.S. District Judge, Arenda Allen, administer the oath of allegiance, I looked into the faces of these people becoming Americans. Their expressions conveyed relief, gratitude, and above all else, humility. They chose to come here and their personal journeys were not easy, but they made it. Their humility made me feel very humble to think that I had been given these rights as a citizen simply by the happenstance of where I was born. And since that day, I ask myself frequently, am I giving to my nation as much as I have been given? We have an important job as citizens to actively participate in our constitutional democracy, and that goes beyond just voting. Our citizenship is the binding contract we all accept as Americans. The conversation we are about to have is important. Let it start here in Williamsburg, but we ask you to carry the question into your own communities and have a conversation around, what does citizenship mean as an American? Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy this conversation.
Good afternoon and welcome to an Us, Past, Present, Future Cornerstone event. My name is Jamar Jones and I'm a member of Colonial Williamsburg's Actor-Interpreter Unit. And I have the pleasure and the privilege of serving as your moderator today as we examine the question, what does citizenship mean as an American? And joining us today to talk about those ideas of citizenship are our renowned panelists. So I think it's a good time that we probably should meet them. Cora Masters Barry. Professor and civic leader Cora Masters Barry has a rich history of activism and has taught political science at the University of the District of Columbia. In addition to her leadership of the Recreation Wish List Committee, which provides a nurturing learning environment for at-promise youth. She serves as president of the Marion Barry Jr. Legacy Foundation, the commissioner of the DC Arts and Humanities Commission, and board member of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation and podcast host of Nothing New Under the Sun. Thank you for being here, Ms. Barry. Fiorina. Fiorina became the first woman to lead a Fortune 50 company when she was appointed the chairman and CEO of Hewlett-Packard in 1999. She also has an extensive experience in the nonprofit world, serving as chairman of Good 360 and Opportunity International, and in advising the federal government. In 2016, she sought the Republican nomination for president. She is founder and chairman of Fiorina Enterprises, which counsels companies on building high-performance teams, developing leaders, and creating equitable and inclusive workplace cultures. CFE's nonprofit subsidiary, the Unlocking Potential Foundation, brings the same expertise to nonprofits and community leaders. Welcome, Carly. Jeffrey Rosen. Jeffrey Rosen is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization whose mission is to educate the public about the U.S. Constitution. Rosen became president and CEO in 2013 and developed the center's acclaimed interactive constitution. Rosen is also a professor of law at the George Washington University Law School, a contributing editor at The Atlantic, an author, and a highly regarded journalist. Thank you for being here, Jeff. And once again, I'm so excited to be with you all today, and I'm excited for the conversation that we are going to have. Now, for you all watching, as originally adopted, the Constitution offered little guidance about citizenship, other than to assume that citizenship of the United States and of the respective states existed. Now, it wasn't until the adoption of the 14th Amendment in 1868 that citizenship was first defined in the Constitution. The amendment states, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the states wherein they reside. So We've been saying this word citizenship quite a bit already, but I think this is a great time to open things up to our panelists to see if we can get this conversation going about what that definition is and what it means to them. So I open the floor to all of our panelists. Can you briefly tell us, what does citizenship mean to you personally? And anyone can begin.
Well, to break the ice, I'll start with a confession, if I may. The truth is, I didn't think much about it for a really long time. In looking back on my life at a different time, I think I took for granted the rights that are mine as a citizen, and I ignored the responsibilities that are mine as a citizen. I took for granted the right that I would be treated fairly under the law. I took for granted the opportunity to get educated or go to work. I took a lot of things for granted. And I didn't even vote for a big part of my life, I'm not proud to say, because I didn't necessarily think it had anything to do with me. It wasn't my responsibility. It was only as I got older and wiser and was exposed to more people in this country who lived very differently than I did, more people around the world who didn't have the chances that I did, that I began to understand that the right of an American citizen is sort of the gold standard when we actually uphold those rights. It's the gold standard of how people should be treated and perceived and respected. And with those gold standard set of rights, which as Beth pointed out in the video, people will undertake perilous journeys to try and attain. With that gold standard of rights and equal protection under the law comes huge responsibilities. I think responsibilities I've come to believe to think not only about ourselves and our particular situation, but all of us who share a community, all of us who share a country. And sometimes that's difficult and messy and tragic. But for me, I now understand, and it took me a long time to understand, that being an American citizen is a right that so many have struggled so long to achieve. And with it come real responsibilities that cause us to think about someone beyond ourselves.
Ms. Barry or Jeff?
Well, I will use the words of a great poet, Langston Hughes, who says, "Let America be America again. For blacks, citizenship is an American dream that never existed. It represents the freedom and the equality that we hoped for but never received."
Thank you. Jeff?
That was beautiful. You asked what citizenship means to me personally. Like many of you, I am the children of immigrants. My grandmother came to the US under a cloak, fleeing from the murderous pogroms in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe. And my grandfather also fled those pogroms. And they came in search of life and religious liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and they found it on these shores. Justice Ginsburg, before she passed, in one of her last speeches at a naturalization ceremony, recalled her own mother, who was my mom. Justice Ginsburg was born a month before my mom in Brooklyn also. Her mom also came over from Eastern Europe and was a bookkeeper. And Justice Ginsburg said, "What's the difference between a bookkeeper and a Supreme Court justice? One generation." Incredibly moving testament to the power of the American opportunity. But you also read those important words from the 14th Amendment. And for me, as a teacher of the Constitution and a learner about the Constitution, citizenship is an opportunity to learn about what those words mean. So you said, from the 14th Amendment, no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws or due process of laws. And you also said that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And you asked for a short answer, and I promise to be pretty short, but just to say all of American constitutional law of the Second Republic is found in that sentence. We fought the Civil War to overturn the infamous Dred Scott decision, which said that African Americans have no rights which white men are bound to respect. If you read the dissenting opinions in Dred Scott, as Lincoln did when he said it had no validity, you'll see Justice McLean saying that Taney was wrong to say that this was a pro-slavery document because Madison said there should be no property in men in the Constitution. And you see Justice Curtis saying that Taney was a bad originalist because 5 of the original 13 colonies recognized the rights of free African Americans. So Dred Scott is overturned 3 times during Reconstruction. First in the 13th Amendment, which bans slavery. Second in the 14th Amendment, which guarantees the rights of privileges or immunities to all citizens and equal protection and due process to all persons. And then in the 15th Amendment, which gives African American men the right to vote. So that's just a glimpse of how central those sacred words are to teaching us about citizenship, but already we see that that promise was unfulfilled, and we know that African American voting rights suppressed for at least another 100 years. Women not given the right to vote until the 19th Amendment was passed in 2020. It's an ongoing struggle, but it's so meaningful to learn about our constitutional history.
Thank you for that, Jeff.
If I may add one thing, you said something really interesting, Jeff, and I know why you said it. You said women were given the right to vote. Here's the truth. No one has been given the right to vote in this country. In every single case, including our founders, the right to vote has been fought for. Equal protection under the law has been fought for. Freedom and respect has been fought for. Sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. The rights, citizenship, the right to vote, it's never been granted. It's always been fought for.
But in the case of African Americans, it's always taken back.
Say more.
That from the 3/5 Compromise to the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, and all the way to the 1964 and the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Whatever is actually given is always taken back. So it really has never existed. Mm-hmm. Because it is as strong as the stroke of a pen.
So
right
the struggle
now,
continues.
As African Americans, we literally, and a lot of people won't agree with this, but this is my opinion, we saved America. And then we took Georgia and saved the Senate so that we could get some things done in America the right way. And then after we did that, in response, over 43 states started in trying to enact legislation to suppress and repress the vote, not because of corruption, but because of turnout. So our citizenship is just up to the opinion of whoever wants to do whatever they want to do when they want to do it. So we've only had a very small time frame in this history of this country, and it was right after the Civil Rights, right during Reconstruction, where there was a moment where African Americans or black people or Negroes, whatever we were called during that period of time, were able to run for office, vote, do whatever we did, and then of course we know the Tilden-Hayes Agreement, and then they moved the Reconstruction out of the way. Black codes became the order of the day, which is another form of enslavement. And just to make sure, because the Constitution in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment gave us the right to vote, they could not say we couldn't vote, so they enacted what? Laws that said, of course you can vote if your grandfather voted. Of course you can vote if you can recite the Constitution. Of course you can vote if you can count how many marbles are in this jar. And of course you can vote if you vote in the general election and not in the primary, and that was called the white primary. So we didn't vote. And then when we tried to vote, they killed us. So any person of color who thinks they have the right to vote and they have full citizenship in this United States of America is illusionary.
So
If
I
I,
have
if
a
I could
great
just
question.
if I could just reinforce that point, which is so important, Carly's as well as Cora's, it's so remarkable, as both of you say, that each of these great amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments and the 19th Amendment, fought because of the mobilization of African Americans and women, persuading, arguing, fighting a war, enshrined in the Constitution, and then as you describe this backlash. It is so striking. The more history you learn, the more struck one is that the promise of the 14th Amendment were thwarted almost as soon as they were adopted, both by what Cora describes, those literacy tests, poll taxes, all of which could have been avoided if earlier drafts of the 14th Amendment had passed. When you look at the early drafts, all of this was anticipated. An early draft of the 14th Amendment would have granted African American voting rights. It falls out because there's no support. An early draft of the 15th would have forbidded poll taxes and literacy tests, but that doesn't pass and they're subverted. And then you have Southern redemption, as Professor Henry Louis Gates calls it, and mobilized terror and lynching, as well as the subversion of the promise of these amendments. And what's so remarkable is it is upheld by the Supreme Court. And it's so important to read those Supreme Court decisions, the civil rights decisions of 1885, which struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which would have granted public accommodations and equal rights in railways and public conveyances 100 years before the Civil Rights Act. The Supreme Court strikes it down. Justice John Marshall Harlan writes his dissenting opinion in that case, and he has writer's block. He can't think about what to say. His wife has put the inkwell that Chief Justice Taney drafted the Dred Scott decision. Once he realizes it's Taney's inkwell, he feels like he's struck by an inspiration from the divine, and this dissent flows out of him, and he says, I predict there will be a day when this court will rue this decision, and indeed, it took the Civil Rights Act of '64 and Brown versus Board of Education to vindicate Harlan's hopes 100 years later. So it's so true what both of you say, but also so important to learn the history, because you can't have a sense of the depth of the backlash, both the legal and the political and the constitutional backlash, unless you study the history.
I have a podcast, excuse me a second,
Oh,
please.
please,
I
go
have
ahead.
to respond to this. These are laws and these are amendments and these are various cases, but they really are still people. And no matter how many amendments you make or pass, or no matter how many laws you pass, at the end of the day, it is still at the whim of the next person who goes and interprets it, or if they want to interpret. So we really are at the will of how people are feeling at that time. Because every one of these, you can do the Slaughterhouse case, 1873, or Plessy versus Ferguson, you can do any of them. But at the end of the day, the pendulum sweeps and moves with the person who is in power. We just went through that. We just went through that. Every law that there is on the books today did not matter for the last 4 years. So the question that needs to be answered is, how do you ensure citizenship for people who have never been given full citizenship in this country? And it really doesn't really get down to too many laws because, well, Georgia just passed a whole bunch of laws and they said you can't give a bottle of water to somebody standing in line.
So, Ms. Barry, my question, you all have raised quite a bit speaking about our history and the origins of some of these early documents. So I want to ask you all about action. What more do we need to do collectively as Americans in order to ensure that there are equal rights for all citizens and that there is an even playing field and open that up to anyone?
So one of the things I would say, I want to go all the way back to something I said at the outset. And it's one of the reasons that Colonial Williamsburg Foundation felt it important to make a statement about the centrality of our right to vote. And that is, action is required, I believe, on all of our parts, on great institutions' parts, to both educate ourselves so that we can learn from the past about how difficult these struggles have been to achieve the right of citizenship, the gold standard for so many, and how easily they can be taken away. I think it's also worth remembering, if you think about the history that Jeff and Cora just went through, and they are both far more expert than I am at telling you that history. But what is remarkable to me when I sit back and hear that is the power, the seduction of an idea like citizenship, like equality, like liberty. The power of that idea to drive people to continue to struggle. Think about it. Think how many generations after generations of people, and now this generation of people, struggles once again. It also is a reminder of how resilient our system of government actually is. That we can go through this and regroup, go through it again and advance a little further and go through it again.
You know, that's exhausting.
Of course it's exhausting.
You do that.
Well,
but you're not going through it. I mean, being black.
Cora, I
is
disagree. I think we're all.
It's exhausting.
I think we all go through it.
The struggle, though, out in the streets are people whose citizenship is being taken. They're being killed in the streets. It's exhausting.
Yes.
I am 75 years old. I was in the middle of the 60s. We did all of that. People know a lot about the civil rights movement, but there was also the Black Power movement. And the things that they were asking for, the things that they were demanding for citizenship, for humanity, they were killed and they were exiled and they were annihilated. And now we're here in 2021 and we're in the same battle of 20. I'm like, it's deja vu all over again. It's exhausting. I mean, I'm worried that my granddaughter is going to have the same experience I'm having. There was January 6th and there was Black Lives Matter. I'm just trying to put some humanity and some reality into this situation. And there were people in the streets because people were being murdered on video and murdered at churches and murdered everywhere. And they were all demanding people, not just black people, a lot of the young people, it was a very diverse group of people. A lot of the young people now do not even deal with race in the way that our generation did. So it was a wonderful thing to see. And then on January 6th, you have these terrorists take over the whole Congress, and they compare it to Black Lives Matter. Comparing Black Lives Matter, and this is what's exhausting about it, to the terrorists that took over the Congress, is like comparing the civil rights movement to a rally of the Ku Klux Klan.
Well,
that's exhausting.
Some people compare it. Some. Many do not. Many understand very well the differences. And I think one of the challenges I think we all have is, this is a country with tremendous diversity, and it is always a temptation. I'm not saying you're doing this, Cora. By the way, Cora and I are dear friends, and we don't agree on everything, but we remain dear friends.
Obvious, right?
And we remain dear friends, and it's part of what I think makes this country great. But we have a common core, a common foundation, something that we both can believe in, and then we can argue about the rest. But I think one of the the fear of the other is as human as anything else. And when people play on that fear of the other, you're different, you're not the same as me, therefore I'm going to fear you, I'm going to demonize you. That's as old as humankind. And it takes all of us to push back against that. And a temptation always is for every one of us. This is also human. We paint with a really broad brush. We say, you look like that guy, therefore you are that guy. And that's wrong. That's wrong.
But if it just stopped there, that would be fine. But we're not just talking about how people treat people. We're talking about economic empowerment.
Yes, absolutely.
We're talking about the kind of things that hold a whole race of people back. It's everywhere. It is in every fiber of this country.
That is right. We have
People
structure.
think it's like the police. Oh, it's not just the police. It's in corporate America. It's in the education system. It's everywhere. It's in the pores of this country.
And by the way, 20 years ago, I would have disagreed with Cora. I would have said, no, that's not true. And today, I know she's absolutely right. There are structures and systems in place that have been in place for so long that they perpetuate. They perpetuate certain things. They perpetuate prejudice. They perpetuate lack of opportunity. It's true for women, although not as true as for African Americans in this country. And I think one of our responsibilities as citizens, one of the things we're trying to do here, actually, is to be able to speak truth about where we actually are so that we can move forward, so we can disagree respectfully, but keep coming back to the fundamentals. And the fundamentals are the ideals that built this country, even though they didn't apply to everyone back then, but nevertheless the power of those ideals and the importance of every struggle, including the one that's going on now, although I can't imagine how exhausting it is, because my experience is not yours, Cora.
If I could reinforce that, both of those central messages, that democracy is exhausting, and that we do share the struggle for democracy and for our ideals is exhausting, and we remain united by those ideals. And it's so urgently important for organizations like Colonial Williamsburg and the National Constitution Center and others to remind us that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men and women, designing their just consent from their just powers from the consent of the government, and whenever the government destroys these rights, it's the right and duty of the people to alter and abolish it. I recited the whole thing because that is the American creed. And understanding how the promise of the Declaration was thwarted in the original Constitution, resurrected by Lincoln at Gettysburg, and slowly becoming what Justice Ginsburg called ever more embracive, so that it embraced the left out people, not just grudgingly, but with open arms. Just one example of the power of constitutional education to cast light on our current debates. You talked about the false equivalence between January 6th and Black Lives Matter. So we can understand that January 6th was the founders' nightmare, because they came to Philadelphia with visions of the failed democracies of Greece and Rome. Madison says, in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. The framers are afraid of mobs. They're afraid of mobs storming government buildings, like Shays' Rebellion in 1787, where mobs are arming the federal courthouse and the armory because they don't want to pay their debts. And they try to create a constitution constrained enough to protect liberty, but strong enough to achieve common purposes, so that the promises of the Declaration can be fulfilled. And the whole point of the Constitution is to slow down deliberation so that mobs can't quickly organize, and by the time they do, their passions will have cooled and reason will prevail. Obviously, we face a civic crisis in this country because there's no time for deliberation. Social media
Can I
has...
ask you a question?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I love your thoughts also about what we do about a world where information travels at light speed. The January 6th mob organizes online based on fake news and conspiracy theories, and the hope of the framers that given time, reason will prevail seems to be under siege.
Then that was going to be my question. Why do you think January 6th happened?
Well, it happened in large part because of algorithms and filter bubbles, which allowed people to believe what wasn't true. So I'll give that the election was stolen. So and one thing I want to say is, I should have started off by saying this, the National Constitution Center is rigorously nonpartisan. I am not allowed to express an opinion about any contested political issue, whatever. All I can do is describe constitutional, not political arguments, and give the arguments on both sides. But I'm completely confident in saying the founders' the nightmare was an armed mob. And the reason that it happened, and I'll share this story, the New York Times about a month ago ran a story about a QAnon conspiracy theorist. She was very convinced the election was stolen. This was a high school and college classmate of mine. I had lucky enough to have a very wonderful education in New York City and at Harvard University, and this classmate of mine had been a thoughtful, very well-educated woman who just went down the algorithm rabbit hole, and she saw YouTube videos about a British yogi, which led her down to some violent conspiracy stuff, and pretty soon she was so addicted to the Facebook likes that she became a conspiracy theorist. Now, this is an urgent, serious problem from our democracy. There is no simple solution to this, especially in a country which puts free expression at the center of our constitutional creed and has no tolerance for government attempting to regulate speech in any way. I don't have easy solutions to the problem, but I'm convinced that history can cast an awful lot of light on it, and we can have very thoughtful and productive debates.
So I would like to lean into something that you all have brought up at the top, and you alluded to some of this when we speak about the incidents, the insurrection on January the 6th. And want to talk about some things that are dominating our news cycle right now in this moment. And of course, legislation has been proposed in several states that would affect voting rights for certain citizens. And so my question to the panel is, does a legislation like this, and you certainly alluded to it already, but does legislation like this create unequal access to the vote and inequality among our citizens? And I would just love for the panel to speak about that.
So the short answer is yes, but let's go back to what Jeff was just saying. No, because it's related to this exact question. The premise, look, I think every single one of us on this panel, and I would guess everyone listening, we all will say the right to vote is so sacred in this country. It's so important in this country that, of course, voting must be secure. It has to be accurate. You can't have people casting 10 ballots. We all agree with that. We all agree with that. The premise, though, of so much of this legislation is that the election was stolen. That's the premise. The election was rigged.
I disagree. The premise is not the election was stolen. The premise is that black people voted, and they didn't know we were going to get out there and vote like we voted, and they want to now find a way to stop us from voting. They don't think the election was stolen. They want to figure out a way that if it happens again, they can turn it over, so they turn it over to the state. The premise of January 6th was not that election was lost. The premise was that the control of white supremacy that was dominating this country under the administration was about to be lost. That election was only important because finally the voices that have been for oppression and for all of the things that are against our democracy was being lost to them. They were losing control over something, and they needed to have their person there. And they wanted to believe the lie because they needed a reason to keep him there. That is the fundamental thing. It was race. It was simply race. And to not say it's race is to not really deal with what is really the foundation of what happens in this country.
So Cora, I agree with you. I think if you look at where the focus of the election was stolen rhetoric went, it was to mostly urban, mostly African American constituencies. That's just a fact if you look at the districts. However, the fundamental premise that, whether we accept it or not, the premise under which so many of these voting rights pieces of legislation are being put forward is the election is not secure. And that is factually not true. The election was secure. In fact, the head of elections, a Trump appointee, said it was the most secure election in US history. And yet, because of, yes, prejudice and racism, but because of technology, so many people only hear a few pieces of information, and they don't necessarily hear all the facts. So they may not hear, actually, this was the most secure election in US history. It wasn't stolen.
Despite the effort to suppress it. And by the way, I'm gonna let you in a little secret. What really got the vote up, other than the uprising over George Floyd and the injustices we face in this country with law enforcement, was turning on the television and seeing post office machines sit out in the back. That was a message to us. They really don't want you to vote. So if I can give a little hint to the racists out there, the more you push, the more we're going to explode. We're going to vote more than we ever voted before. Just keep on passing these laws. There's one where we came from. Just keep on doing it. Inspire us. So that's what it's really all about. Because you can't tell me that you're going to pass a law about securing the election and make it illegal for somebody to give somebody a bottle of water in a line. That is about trying to figure out how to keep black folks from being comfortable to come to the polls. I got news for you. We on our way.
Amen, sister. Amen, sister.
I mentioned that my job is to talk about the constitutional dimensions of these laws, and the constitutional challenges to the Georgia law and other laws that are being passed are very complicated, I have to report. And that's for a bunch of reasons. In the claim, which Cora has just said is true, she says that it's obvious that these laws are passed because the effort is to disenfranchise black voters, African American people. So that claim is going to go to court. Before the Shelby County decision in 2013, you could have challenged this under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which says that any change in a voting process or procedure in a state which had formally discriminated against African Americans when the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 and renewed in 2003 is presumptively invalid and has to get federal approval. That provision was struck down by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 vote. The majority of the court says there's no evidence of ongoing discrimination in these states, and therefore it's not necessary. Justice Ginsburg's vigorous dissent says just because you're not getting wet in a rainstorm doesn't mean you throw away the umbrella, and she says this is indefensible as constitutional law. That leaves Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and I know this is really going into the weeds, but it's important for us to try to understand it, because if those laws are to be struck down, this is the only part of the Voting Rights Act that remains. Section 2 says that African Americans should have an equal opportunity to elect representatives of their choice. And it doesn't require an intent to discriminate, but says that a change in voting procedures that has the effect of making it harder for African Americans to elect representatives of their choice violates Section 2. There's a case before the Supreme Court that the court heard a few weeks ago, and it's going to decide by June, that could decide the future of the Voting Rights Act. And there are three positions. Here's what the options are. The more liberal justices would say this Voting Rights Act is a change in procedures that has the effect of making it harder for African Americans to vote. It should fall under Section 2. It's not clear that there's a majority for that position. Some of the more conservative justices are going to say you have to find voting discrimination in the state as a whole, not just in the affected area. And if the state as a whole is the denominator, then the number of African Americans who are affected is relatively small, and the Georgia law would pass muster. And then a group of justices led by Justice Thomas say Section 2 itself is unconstitutional. Because the Constitution is colorblind, any attempt by Congress to forbid voting changes that have the effect but not intent of discrimination is itself unconstitutional. If that provision prevails, and it could, then there's literally no federal protection against voting discrimination, and all of these laws would be impossible to challenge at the federal level unless the H.R. 1, the Vote Act that's pending in Congress, were to pass. That would also forbid all these changes, but as we know, that's not likely to pass. So that was just the Constitution 101 options, and it's striking that there's not a huge amount of legal pegs left, but we'll find out more when the Supreme Court rules.
Isn't that sad, though? I mean, if you really stop and think about it, just really close your eyes and think about it. Isn't that sad that we need a Voting Rights Act? Isn't it sad that when you are born, you're not automatically registered to vote? Isn't that what democracy is for? Why are we having Voting Rights Acts and amendments? Isn't it sad? The question you really need to answer, why don't they want us to vote?
And to add to Cora's question, I think, again, assuming we have a range of opinions out there, I was interested to note that at current count, probably 130 CEOs of major American corporations have issued statements on this subject, on the subject of voting rights. And that's very unusual. Having been a CEO of a publicly traded company, it is very unusual for that many CEOs to step out on an issue with this much heat around it. The reason they stepped out is because they feel they need to weigh in on a subject that impacts all of their constituencies, whether it's employees or customers. But they made a very important point, I think. The CEOs in Michigan, for example, where one of these bills is moving forward, all of the CEOs of the major firms in Michigan made a joint statement, and they laid out a set of principles, 8 principles. I commend it to you for your reading. My guess is virtually every American would agree with every single one of those principles. But one of the most important principles and the most practical principles was, if you are going to reform voting, you must do it on a bipartisan basis. Because if you do it with one party pushing for it and one party pushing against it, you are creating division around a sacred right that should unify us. And that, it seems to me, is so sensible. Whatever people think about a particular bill, however it ends up in the Supreme Court, why on earth, knowing how diverse our country is, why on earth would we be willing to proceed? Why would we allow our political leaders of either party to proceed on a purely partisan basis, knowing that the outcome of that will be more struggle, more backlash, more inspiration, to use Cora's term, and more backlash on the other side? And so when our political leaders fan the flames of division, instead of reminding us of the ideals that should unite us, despite all of our differences, then we're in a sad place.
So, thank you all for this. Now, throughout the centuries, we all know, and I'm certainly sure if there are history scholars out there, we have had many citizen-led protests, right? Including the American Revolution, right? But there seems to be a lot of objections to protests and things led by Black citizens, citizens of color in general. And so what I want to ask you all as a panel, 1, is there a right way to protest? And 2, what does it say about us as a nation? Because there are so many divided opinions and ideas, and I'm certainly sure those watching thoughts on what protests should be and who has the right to do that. So I want to pose those questions and see what you all have to say about that.
Well, I think first you said something very important that we all need to remember. This nation was birthed in protest. Protest is one of our birthrights. Freedom of speech and freedom of expression. We've talked about all of these rights that I, for one, took for granted for too many years, have been struggled for. I think it's also true that too many people in this country feel threatened by the sight of a group of people of color protesting. They feel afraid. That's wrong, it's shameful, it's sad, but it's clearly true. Because we see people reacting differently when you have white people protesting than if you have Black people protesting. Again, we can't make progress unless we tell each other the truth. I would say that it's important to protest peacefully. I would say it's very important to be respectful of those people who are there to keep the peace, assuming they are doing their jobs appropriately, and some do not. But assuming peacekeepers are there to keep the peace and do their jobs appropriately, I think we should be respectful of them. But protest is what this country has always been about. And it's what it's about now as well.
Yeah. I think that's great. Any other thoughts on that? And it's all right?
Yeah, yes, as Carly and you said, the American Revolution was an armed protest. But it's so striking that although the framers fought the Boston Tea Party to throw the unconstitutional tea into the river because they thought the taxes Britain was imposing was unconstitutional, they were careful to not engage in reckless mob violence. They called it crowd action. And actually, they threw the tea into the harbor and then swept the decks and compensated the ship owner because they had to break a lock in order to get the tea. So that was a sense that the Boston Tea Party was nonviolent No one came close to being killed, and it was on behalf of a constitutional principle, rather than, at the same time of the American Revolution, the attack on the home of Governor Thomas Hutchison, whose books were burned, his papers were destroyed, and his house was almost burned down. So the framers distinguished between violent mobs and mobilized political protest on behalf of constitutional ideals. Then comes the Civil War, and Lincoln and Frederick Douglass repeatedly denounce mobocracy. Lincoln, in his speech to the Springfield Lyceum in 1837, uses the word mob 8 times. Talks about Andrew Jackson as king mob, and talks about African Americans and abolitionist newspaper editors like Elijah Lovejoy who are being lynched and burned by armed racist mobs. So the idea of mob suddenly becomes racialized and becomes even more discredited. So this reinforces Carly's important distinction between vigorous, meaningful, peaceful political protest and armed violence. And this distinction is also central to our First Amendment understanding. And if there's anything that we must teach our students, it is that the framers, at least Madison and Jefferson, in the Virginia and Kentucky Resolution believed, and the Supreme Court ratified the idea that speech in America can only be banned when it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. That's the test. It comes from the Brandenburg case in 1969. Short of that, the right to peacefully assembly and petition are 2 of the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment, along with speech, press, and religion. It's protected unless it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. I must share the inspiring words of Justice Brandeis, which express the American ideal of protest and the American free speech tradition more perfectly than anything else, because I am so eager to inspire you to read the Whitney versus California concurrence, where Brandeis expresses these words. He's talking about the revolution, and he says, "Those who won our revolution believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty." That's a quote from Pericles' funeral oration. They believe that liberty to speak as you will and to think as you speak are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth, that without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile, that with them, discussion affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest threat to freedom is an inert people, and that public discussion is a political duty, and this would be a fundamental principle of the American government. It's all there. It's like the Declaration of Independence. It just perfectly expresses the American commitment to vigorous dissent, protest, and assembly, and at the same time to peaceable discussion and deliberation.
I would like to ask the panel one question that was proposed from a viewer.
Answer that one.
Yeah, let Ms. Barry.
You want, please, Ms.
Sorry.
Barry, please.
And if you hadn't interrupted me, I would have said, except if you're black. So I submit that it is not what kind of protest that matters in this country, but what you're protesting about. And this weekend is the anniversary of the letters from Birmingham Martin Luther King wrote. And this topic brought me to this excerpt from one of his many prolific letters I recommend, like he's recommending you, what did you tell him to read these letters from Birmingham. They're amazing. And he says, "I must make 2 honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom and who lives by a mythical concept of time, who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail in this purpose, they become dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace in which the Negro passively accepted his unjust plight to a substantive personality, in which the Negro accepted his effort to a substantive and positive peace in which all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Actually, we would engage in nonviolent, direct action, are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with, like a boil that can never be cured as long as it's covered up, but must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must be exposed with all the tension it exposed creatures to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. In your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to trust and his philosophical inquiries precipitated the act by the misguided populace in which they made him drink hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never ceased? That's what bothers people, not the peacefulness of it, but the purpose.
Thank you for sharing that, Ms. Barry. I would like to ask the panel, we are slowly beginning to wind down on our time, but I would like to propose this question that comes from one of our viewers, Kirsten. She asked, do the panelists believe that due process is something that is only the right of citizens? Why do those seeking citizenship not receive such equal protection? And if someone can answer that as briefly as possible.
I can answer that very briefly by quoting the 14th Amendment. It says, no state shall deny any person equal protection of the law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction life, liberty, or property without due process. So the rights of citizens are privileges or immunities. The rights of persons include due process, and therefore the framers of the 14th Amendment believed that all persons, citizens and non-citizens alike, were entitled to the rights of due process and equal protection, period.
And wouldn't we want it that way? Wouldn't we want it that way? I mean, it's clearly not always that way. But if American citizenship is the gold standard, this country, for all our terrible problems, for all our backsliding, for all our racism, for all the things that are still wrong with us, this nation was conceived as something higher and better and more inspiring than any other nation. And shouldn't we always aspire to be higher and better? Shouldn't we call people to their better angels? And so it is true that not all persons who are not citizens receive due process. It is also true that not all citizens receive due process. We have seen that play out over the last several months. But should we not, as citizens who love this country, who want this country to achieve its ideals, should we not want all persons, all citizens, to receive due process?
So we are slowly coming to the close of our time together, and I know this conversation is so rich we can continue on, but I do want to hear from each one of our panelists before we go, some of your final thoughts. And Ms. Barry, I'm recalling something you said, the question you posed early on when you said, isn't it sad? and it makes you think about a lot of things. You know, again, I say a lot of things are dominating our news cycle right now, and all these sort of thoughts. We've talked about things that have happened in the recent months, in the last few years, but my question to all of you all to share with the people are, if you have any final thoughts about what are we to do now? What should we do as citizens of this country? I know that's a pretty large question, but I'm curious, do you have any sort of offering or some sort of call to action?
What we should do now about what?
What should we do now with all that we see, all that's happening, all the continued unrest in this idea of, on paper, we all are citizens, and many have citizenship here, but it's not equal across the board. It's not equal in the treatments that we see of people. It's not equal in the events that are constantly filling our timelines and things. And so my question is there a call to action that you would like to leave our viewers with about what is there to do as citizens and where do we go?
Stop killing black people. Let's start there.
That's a good place to start. I guess I would add a couple things. Number one, I think we, instead of being afraid of the struggles and the protests that are going on, we should support them, applaud them, understand them. Because actually struggle and protest is what this country has always been about. It's what it's always been about. And it still is about struggle and protest.
It's also about pain and frustration.
Yes, it's about pain and frustration and exhaustion. Yes, absolutely. And yet, we keep moving forward. Sometimes 3 steps back for 2 steps forward, but we keep moving forward.
Teach our
So
children better.
support the struggle, the protest. The second thing I would say is, I think we have to bring empathy back into the public space. We have become so judgmental of each other in all of our public discourse. We demonize each other. I think we have to bring empathy back because we are a very diverse nation, and it is hard sometimes to understand people who are different than ourselves. Empathy is the ability to value someone else's experience, their life, their perspective. We need more empathy. And I guess finally I would say, when I get discouraged, I go back and read some of these words. Because even though when the founders wrote them, they didn't mean them to apply to everybody.
That's right.
The thing is, those words have incredible power. Wasn't it Victor Hugo who once said, "There is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come"? This nation is built on an unbelievably powerful idea. And so when we get discouraged or we get frustrated, we need to go back to those ideas and read them again and rest up and go forward again.
I agree, amen.
I agree, amen, as well, and both of you have talked about the urgent need. Teach our children, said Cora, and remember the words that made us, said Carly. And it is so urgently important that institutions like Colonial Williamsburg and the National Constitution Center are shining beacons of constitutional education for the world. This is such a challenging time, but it's also such an exciting opportunity with the platform of the internet. And platforms like the Interactive Constitution, which you mentioned, and which has received 54 million hits since it launched and is now the most Googled constitution in the world. We can bring together the greatest liberal and conservative scholars of diverse backgrounds to debate every clause of the Constitution, as we've done. We can have podcasts, panels like this one, and public discussions, and live and archived classes. And I'm so excited that we're having early discussions with the Constitution Center in Williamsburg to unite around the Constitution 101 classes that the Constitution Center is creating that will teach high school, middle school, and college students and adult learners the basic principles of the Declaration and the Constitution and Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement. The foundational text, all collected free and online, and the ability to study them and get course credit for them or enrich yourself as citizens. It is such a challenging time, but such a meaningful and exciting time for learning, and it's so exciting that we're going to be doing it together.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our entire panel. Once again, Cora Masters Barry, Carly Fiorina, Jeffrey Rosen. We're so glad that you all could join us today, and I want to say thank you for your willingness to have this important conversation, and thank you for sharing your perspective with all of our viewers, everyone watching. And thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you for your continued support of Colonial Williamsburg. And I'm certainly sure our hope, my hope, and probably the hope of the entire panel is that you are encouraged and you're inspired to really think about what is citizenship in your life. And hopefully you're inspired to really be an active citizen in your own community and in your world, and continue this conversation further. It doesn't have to stop right here with this panel. You can have it in your home and with others. And so we appreciate you joining us. And also we hope that next month you join us for our next Us, Past, Present, Future panel, where we will discuss the United Colonies and how 13 very different colonies came together to form one independent nation. And I also like to take this time to thank our donors. I'd like to specifically thank Mark and Iris Koblitz, without whom Us, Past, Present, and Future would not be possible. So with that, thank you once again for your time, and we'll see you next time.
And thank you to our intrepid moderator, Jamar Jones.